Section 20 of Richelieu by Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7, The University of Paris, the Jesuits and the College of France, Philosophy and Erudition, Part 2. We have only enumerated a few of La Motte Leveillet's writings. They form, in the best edition, Dresden, 1756 to 1759, 14 octavo volumes, the best known of these compositions being entitled Cinq dialogues faits à l'imitation des anciens par Horatius Touberon. We cannot give here a complete analysis of this work, and we must be satisfied with a brief glance at its contents. The supposed Horatius Touberon, imitating the Ciceronian style of conversation, deals first with the diversity and contradictions which exist in the opinions, manners, and customs of men. The second dialogue, Le Banquet Sceptique, treats of everyday usages and the details of common life. In the third, we have an eloquent praise of solitude, the lasting joys of which are more than a compensation for the pretended pleasures of society, and the useless and noisy occupations of the madding crowd. The fourth, professing to be a praise of the rare and eminent qualities of the asses of his time, reminds us of the apologies or fanciful panegyrics which have added so much to the reputation of Apuleius, Erasmus, Machiavel, and Giordano Bruno. The fifth and concluding dialogue treats of the various religions, and a general resume of the whole work is contained in the following Spanish motto, which is very significant in its brevity: De las cosas más seguras, la más segura es dudar. Of all things which are most certain, the most certain is to doubt. The dialogues we have just been noticing are La Motte Leveillet's last work, and may therefore be regarded as the final and definitive expression of his views. He professes to have written them as an ancient and heathen philosopher, for the exclusive perusal of philosophers, and not for the general public. Gabriel Naudé must be next noticed, 1600 to 1653. His life, like that of La Motte Leveillet, was spent amongst books, and he held in succession the post of librarian to President de Mesmes, and to the Cardinals Bagny, Richelieu, and Mazarin. The principles of Pyrrhonism, as they leave nothing certain and admit of no absolute, well-defined rule of right and wrong, are subversive of all morality, and this feature is apparent in Gabriel Naudé's writings, more distinctly perhaps than in those of any of his contemporaries belonging to the same school of thought. Thus we find him in his Considérations politiques sur les coups d'État, Rouen, 1639, quarto, recommending the theories of the most unblushing Machiavellianism. All means, he asserts, are good for a statesman to encompass his ends. Murder, poison, wholesale massacres. As a consequence, the dreadful episode of St. Bartholomew's Day is openly extolled as a masterpiece of statecraft. A man's views of politics, says M. Sainte-Beuve, depends on his ethical system. A politician is a man who undertakes to guide his fellow creatures, and according to the opinion he has of them, he will lead them in this direction or in that. La Rochefoucauld could not, for instance, but be of the school of Machiavel. When we are young, we form naturally a high estimation of mankind. We belong to the liberal side. As we grow older, bitter experience teaches us to moderate our enthusiasm and to adopt a more severe and stern conception of government. Such was the case with Gabriel Naudé. He did not belong to that illustrious band of statesmen such as Othman, Labotie, and Baudin, who during the 16th century anticipated, so to say, the generous doctrines of Montesquieu, Quesnay, and l'Abbé de Saint-Pierre. His immediate ancestor was Louis XI, the famous aphorism, Qui nescit dissimulare, nescit regnare, was for him the maxim of all rulers, whether kings, emperors, or popes. He was residing in Italy as the guest of Cardinal de Bagni when he composed the book which of all others has done so much harm to his memory. For him, the authors who are constantly making long discourses about religion, clemency, justice, liberality, are mere rhetoricians. Did not Charron say that the justice of a sovereign is not expected to move as warily as that of private individuals? Richelieu may have overstepped the limits of strict justice when he ordered Montmorency to be beheaded, but the beheading of Montmorency is perhaps the reason why an honest bourgeois of the Rue Saint-Denis could live quietly and happily at home. Such is the system of Gabriel Naudet. His amusing works reflect with great accuracy the feelings and opinions, nay, the events of the day. Thus the Apologie pour tous les grands personnages qui ont été faussement accusés de magie is a book which, published in 1625, between the tragic death of the Maréchal d'Ancre and that of Urbain Grandier, is extremely characteristic of the epoch. There was at that time, throughout the length and breadth of France, a kind of sorcery epidemic, which stimulated the zeal of men like Laffemas and Laubardemont, sent to the stake many an innocent person. Gabriel Naudet patiently sits down to show that Zoroaster, Orpheus, Numa, Pythagoras, Virgil, etc., were neither sorcerers nor magicians, according to the usual sense of these words, but that they could be designated as mages, inasmuch as they were inspired by the highest wisdom. Whenever Naudet's religious views are alluded to, great stress is laid upon a certain page where two characters introduced by him discuss the trite subject as to the possibility of any pernicious doctrine being derived from the Scriptures. Not from the Scriptures rightly understood, says one of the interlocutors, but for want of sticking to the interpretations which the Catholic Church gives to them. These sacred books have often been the cause of many disorders, so far as morality goes, as in the Book of Kings and other parts of the Old Testament, and to the same extent, so far as doctrine is concerned, in the writings of the New Testament, where it is stated in a most puzzling manner, especially by St. Paul. There is no doubt that, like Gassendi, Lamotte Leveillé, and many other philosophers of the day, Gabriel Naudet was a free thinker. In fact, we might mention a famous letter of Guy Patin, to whom we shall allude presently, showing that in private and convivial meetings with his friend, his satirical dispositions often brought him quite close to the sanctuary, but his motto was intus ut libet, foris ut mos est. And accordingly, however freely he might think on the subject of religion, politics, and philosophy, he took good care in his relations with society to say nothing which might offend received opinions or excite suspicion. In addition to the Considérations politiques, Gabriel Naudet published several other works, the most remarkable of which are Instruction à la France sur la vérité de l'histoire des frères de la Rose-Croix, Paris, 1623, 8 volumes. Avis pour dresser une bibliothèque, Paris, 1627, 8 volumes. And Mascourat, ou jugement de tout ce qui a été imprimé contre le Cardinal Mazarin, etc., quarto. This last production, written in the form of a dialogue, is an apology of Mazarin against the innumerable pamphlets published against him. But whilst giving the panegyric of the cardinal, Naudet contrives to speak freely de omnibus rebus et quibusdam aliis. Guy Patin completes this amusing and original trio. Guy Patin, the champion of antiquity, the fanatic worshipper of Hippocrates and Galen. He was one of the noisiest members of the Paris Faculté de Médecine, and let us add, one of the most spiteful. as his persecution of the excellent and truly admirable Théophraste Renaudot sufficiently proves. The medical body in the metropolis was essentially at that time a close borough, and anyone venturing to infringe its dictates or to disregard its privileges was hunted down in the most disgraceful manner. When, in the amusing scene of the Malade Imaginaire, the praeses asks the candidate if he is ready to swear, essere in omnibus consultationibus anciani aviso, aut bono, aut movaiso, he merely puts a question for which, if it had been answered in the negative, Guy Patin would certainly have plucked the wretched undergraduate. He was not of a precisely devout character, but his devotion to the old routine had no parallel. The theory of the circulation of the blood was not in Hippocrates. Galen knew nothing about chemistry, ergo Harvey's discovery was a fond delusion, and chemistry a useless piece of legerdemain. But the Arabs? Well, the Arabs were mere charlatans, and it's no wonder that the medical school of Montpellier, guilty of medical heresy, should support them. Guy Patin detested antimony because it was a chemical product, and he hated quinquina because its properties had been discovered by the Jesuits. Bleeding and senna were his sole remedies, and Boileau's line might have been applied to his patients: l'un meurt vide de sang, l'autre plein de séné. He used to bleed children and old people almost as copiously as young men and women. He ordered himself to be bled 7 times for a cold. He bled his mother-in-law, an old lady of 80. A child of 3 days is seized with convulsions. Quick, the lancet! Madame Patin had to submit as a dutiful wife. She was bled 8 times in the arm and nearly as often in the foot. Whenever he has to describe one of his professional antagonists, he shows all the qualities of a good hater, and indulges in abuse so exaggerated that it misses its aim and becomes positively amusing. Here's an extract or two. If M. Duroux knew only to lie in the circulation of the blood, he would know just 2 things, the former of which I hate, whilst I care nothing about the latter. Dr. Bourdelot is another man of the same kind. He lies almost as often as he opens his mouth, and he deceives his patients also whenever he can. He is a thorough courtier. He dances attendance upon the apothecaries, and is the humble servant of the Arabic boasters. He is a frightful liar, a gambler, and a rake. Guy Patin was certainly the most eccentric of the early 17th century oddities. He deserves as such the foremost place in the front rank, by the side of Scudéry, Cyrano de Bergerac, Sorel, and Saint-Amand. His character is made up of contradictions, and would be worth studying for its own sake, even if the pugnacious doctor had not been mixed up with many of the disputes and controversies of his day. It is somewhat astonishing that a man of his nature, who held so loosely by all the opinions which were then current, and who affected so much independence of mind, should have been, on medical doctrines, a blind and unreasonable supporter of exploded absurdities, a conservative to the backbone. His hatred of Cardinal Mazarin was equalled only by his detestation of those whom he designated superciliously as the circulateurs, and the champions of other anatomical and physiological truths. And he might have sat for M. Diafoirus, M. Bourgon, and M. Fleuron in Molière's plays. His wit and his powers of sarcasm were unparalleled. They drew around him a large circle of admirers, and the grands seigneurs of the day, who honoured him by an invitation to dinner, were wont to slip a louis d'or under his plate, by way both of acknowledging his wit and of encouraging him to further exploits. A well-known critic, Vigneul Marvy, says of Guy Patin that he was satirical from head to foot. His hat, his collar, his cloak, his doublet, his hose, his boots, in fact, his whole costume, was a defiance to fashion and a kind of protest against vanity. He had the appearance of a Cicero and the wit of Rabelais. Patin's correspondence was published after his death, and as it had never been intended to go beyond the persons to whom the several letters were addressed, it is an invaluable treasure of plain-spoken and sincere remarks on the events and characters of the day. It combines spite and wit, jokes and anecdotes, amusing remarks and too often coarse descriptions, the whole being copiously interlarded with Latin quotations. This collection of letters, the best though very imperfect edition of which was published by M. Réveillé, Paris, in 3 octavo volumes, Paris, 1846, is, with the exception of a few unimportant essays and speeches, all that remains to us of the Rabelaisian doctor who succeeded to Riollon in the medical lectureship at the Collège de France. End of section 20.